Okay, so yeah, so there's some changes to the syllabus. There's a handful of assignments, starting with this first take-home, that got kicked further down the road, so they're not in the same places they once were. Just to give people more time to work on them. So take note of that. Okay, the other thing is I posted that assignment. I know you're working on a different assignment for me right now, but this one I posted. This is due on the This is going to be due on the 25th. So when are all assignments due in this course? I heard a lot of really quiet whispering. When are they due? Yeah, they're due Friday at 11:59. So everything is always due Friday at 11:59. The reason why 11:59 is because on Blackboard, that's when it transitions to the next day. So, which sounds crazy to say, like I used to say midnight, but you'd be surprised how many people turn stuff in at 11:59 in 30 seconds. So it's due at 11:59. So. This is September 25th, yeah. So, and this is our first take home. So, first thing to notice, we go down. Does anybody know why professors do page minimums? Like a lot of your professors do this, right? Why do you think they do it?
They don't want to, like, I guess, tell you when to, like, stop having your, like, I don't know, never mind.
Anyone else? So what do you think? Do they do it because they care?
Well, if you like type enough, it shows you like actually understand it. I don't know.
No. That's good. Maybe a slightly different wording. What do people think? It's because this is the smallest I think you can answer this question and get full credit. Right? So like really it's like when you see page minimums, it's an explanation of detail. Not like that I really care how much you're writing. Like in fact, like writing a lot and just putting a lot of words in there to get to the end of what you're writing, actually like you're learning really bad writing practices. Because really like if you go on any farther, like if any of you guys are interested in grad school, you're constantly going to be forced to write shorter and shorter things. People really care about concision, getting the most out of it. And if you're a concise writer, if you can get what you want to get across fairly easily, then you should write a page. If you are not a concise writer, you may consider writing more. I have no page maximum, so you can write as much as you want, right? And I don't mean this to be intimidating, it's just good advice, right? Like, if you're a fairly concise writer, you should probably need about a page of details to actually get to the right amount. And with this one, each of them are a page. That's just kind of what I felt. Future assignments, I may have ones that are half a page. If that's the case, you'll have some more questions. Or I could have less questions, and one of them might be 2 pages. It's just kind of depends on the material. So that's one thing to look at. Okay. So the overarching question. So answer all the following questions, fulfilling the page length specified in each question. I just think it's good to point that out. That's the only reason why I do that, because I think it's good to know why your teachers do what they do, rather than just being told what to do. Every question should cite. So each of the questions down here should cite either our lecture or the readings. You can do both, but it has to have at least one for every single question. In these questions, I actually specifically reference certain articles. You should cite those articles, but at least one of the 3, you're going to have to cite the lecture. Because overarching wise, I also want you to cite our course, I say lecture, but our course discussions, right? So I want you to cite our discussions as well. The reason why is we actually cover some different material sometimes in the lectures than the papers, right? And I'm kind of testing to make sure that you are engaging with both, right? So that's really, if you think about it, so I want you to write in each question about at least the readings or the lecture. But overarchingly, you have to write about both. Does that make sense? People got that? Okay. Direct quotes are encouraged. Quoting's great. I like quoting. When I write, I quote a lot. It looks like a collage usually of somebody else's words. What's some reasons why we quote? What do you think? What's a good reason to quote? There's a couple of good reasons why quoting is a good practice.
Well, depending on the paper, like makes your point stronger.
What's that?
Like if you're making a point, using like a direct quote will make your points a little stronger.
Yeah. If you want to say an author says this, there's no better way of saying that than actually putting their own words up there. Yeah. So it makes your claim stronger. You're providing good evidence. Also, a lot of times other people say things better than we can, right? And then whether or not you're a good writer, right? Like sometimes somebody says something and like they got it, right? They capture it. You just quote it. That way you don't have to try to think about how to write it different. So direct quoting is encouraged. It's a good practice to get used to. You don't have to. You're not going to like lose points if you don't. But and actually, like in some ways, it's a little quicker to use quotes sometimes too. You may use outside sources. I put that in there because people always write me after the fact and they're like, "Can I use any outside sources?" The answer is yes, you can. You don't have to. There's no, like, you should be able to answer every single question that I ask with nothing but the material from class. And there's actually a risk if you use too many outside sources, you might not actually get around to talking about the material from class, right? Which could reduce your grade, but you may use outside sources if you so choose. You should cite everything you're using. So you should cite the class discussions. Depending on which format you're going to use, sometimes they have like things for presentations, or sometimes they have citation formats for even informal conversations. If you can cite those, that way, if whatever one you're using doesn't have that, you can really, for the class discussion, just kind of make it up, as long as it kind of fits within what normally you do when you cite. And then, yeah, so when you use a course reading, you should cite them. I want you to do, I want to at least see you using in-text citations as well, and I want page numbers. I want you to tell me where you're getting stuff from. That's really good for me to see you engaging in that way, right? As a understanding of how you're doing it. So, use precise page numbers. All that clear? So those are my overarching guidelines for writing the take-homes. This portion of the take-home will stay the same for all 4 of our take-homes. The questions change, but the format's going to be completely identical. Other than the fact that the number of questions may change, like I said, depending on how much detail I want you to write in. Okay, there's other requirements. And these are just standard academic writing things. Size 12, Times New Roman font, double spaced with 1-inch margins. So, yeah.
Does it matter to you if like 3 different questions, I guess the 3 different questions on 3 separate docs or 1 doc?
I prefer them in 1 doc just because it's easier to like open and grade. And it's easier for me to give feedback because if I want to say something to you, I might actually type comments directly into the document sometimes. And that's going to be easier to manage with 1. So I do prefer 1. Most people do that anyways.
Does it matter if it's like a Word document or a Google doc?
I want a Word document. Yeah, I want it to be in a Word document. Or a PDF. You can do a PDF too. That's why I said Word was mandatory. And part of that is like, if I'm making comments and you're using Google Docs, you may not be able to read any of my comments. And also, like, you might get it in this nice, clear format, and it might come through, but when you turn it in and open it in Word, it might not be in Times New Roman, it might not be size 12, it might screw with your formatting. So it makes it really hard for me to tell whether you're following the instructions if you use Google Docs. In Google Docs, the Times New Roman is wrong. That's like, it's just not the right font, because they can't get the rights to the word Times New Roman. I know that sounds really nitpicky, but like going back to like, this is kind of like, this is the standard of how you do it. So it's just good to learn how to do that, right? Now, if you go into the business world, they don't use Times New Roman, they use Courier, but in academic stuff, Times New Roman, you don't know what you're going to do. Okay, so that's just good formatting practices. Okay, lastly, there are no right or wrong answers. I literally have no answer in mind when I write the questions. The questions are vague enough. They're just sort of probing questions to get you writing about it. So I'm not looking for you to say something in particular. Really, the only way that you're going to get points knocked off is if you don't show that you understand things, right? That's really all that I'm looking for. So write about it. You can be creative in how you want to write about it. You can, you know, whatever, right? So there's no specifically like right or wrong answers to any of these questions. And a lot of you will have a lot of different answers, and all of them will be right. So that's perfectly okay. I require that you use, which, you know, we were talking about citing before, some valid form of citation. I don't care what valid form of citation you use. Most students are going to use MLA because that's what you learn in your English classes. But if you're on the track to, you know, becoming a psychologist and you want to use APA, by all means. If you're on track to be a sociologist or criminologist, you want to use ASA. By all means, if you're a historian, you should probably want to be a historian or a humanities person. You might practice using Chicago on me, who's not going to mark you down. You can use Oxford if you want. Nobody uses Oxford in the United States. But whatever format you want, it's up to you. So, okay. Any questions so far? When I was in graduate school, they told me that students like rubrics. So I made a rubric. I use it for absolutely everything I grade. It's always the same rubric. So, but it's pretty detailed into how I make decisions. So, so if you look through, I have set categories. This is what the grade, which will achieve different grades. I actually do use this. Strangely enough, I often can't remember what's on it, even though I've been using it for a decade. And I will literally get it up and look at it quite regularly and trying to think through what people's grades should be. I actually take grading really seriously. I'm not a harsh grader, but I really try to get an accurate, accurate grade for you. To more is like, if anything, a type of communication, right? So, so if you want to know how I'm going to make decisions, that's really how I'm going to make decisions. Although I will also tell you on the other end why you got the grade you did. So I will give you a sufficient amount of detail on, you know, in the text itself when I return it to you. So this is why you received the grade you did. So I may not give you notes if you have an A though, just so you know. So
can I just, this is kind of random, but can I just ask why after D it says E instead of F?
Oh yeah. That's because I started in the state school system, right? Most of the time, most state colleges use E's. I like D because it's just a logical progression. So DE, like F feels really mean. It sounds like I'm hurling an insult rather than giving an assessment of your grade. So I like, in some ways, kind of like didn't want to change it, so I just did. And E is just not a very good paper, and F is like, you failed! I don't want to tell you you failed. You didn't fail, you just didn't turn in a very good paper. Like, so, yeah, I know here we use F's. If you get an E in the class, you will get an F in the class. Yeah. Okay, any other questions? Well, only once every 2 years somebody picks up on that. Okay. So our first question is, we read 2 articles on culture, Green's Booze Riot and Cambry's How Else Would You Take a Photo? In each article, how does the society around the people interviewed affect their use of culture? How does culture affect their perspectives and or identities? Okay on that? So, and these are things that like we talked about kind of in length, so don't, so that, you know, it should be easy to pull something out. Explain some theories of identity and social interaction. How do we see these theories being applied in Sandberg's, drinking stories as an area of genre, and hooligans exploring spoiled and celebrated identities of young and homeless drug users? And your final question will be, for our week on criminology, we read Chartrand's Unsettled Times and Maglione's The Political Rationality of Restorative Justice. What are these 2 articles' critique of the current criminal justice system? Even though these are critiques of other places in the world, how can we use them to understand the criminal justice system here in the United States? Make sense? Okay, any other questions about the paper? Or not the paper, this is the first take home. No? Wonderful. Great. I'm glad it's so clear. If you have questions as you move on, like always, go ahead and ask them. Time. Oh, maybe. Is that right? Why is this so difficult? So we left off talking about colonialism and the penal system in Canada, right? And we had just talked about sort of like the logic of colonialism. Does anybody remember what we were talking about in terms of the logic of colonialism? You guys want to reiterate some of the points we were talking about so far? This is what notes are for. Yeah, go ahead.
My colonialism still goes on today. Obviously not necessarily like exactly the same way. I think sometimes like it's not something I ever stopped occurring.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And when we just right towards the end, we were talking about that there's a logic to colonialism. Do people remember this? Yeah.
Was it about the system of resource extraction?
So yeah, that was what colonialism was. So it was a system of resource extraction paired with this sort of very violent sort of, oh, go ahead.
I reckon that it's often followed by genocide.
Yeah. Yeah, so that was in our like definition of colonialism, right? So colonialism is a resource extraction regime often paired with these sort of genocidal actions.
You're all coming out of the prison system, like replaced by institution.
Yeah, so the prison system replaced segregation. So I think we could just talk broadly in this and be like, how is a prison similar to this process we talked about for colonialism? What ways are prisons similar to the act of colonization? Yeah.
A lot of like prisons use like prison labor, or like companies use like prison labor. So like the people that are in prison, they like use them to do stuff. I don't know about that.
So yeah, prisons do extract people's labor, increasingly so.
Yeah.
You get things like, a lot of the services the prison functions off of the work of unpaid prisoners often now. In the past it didn't. They hired people to do that. They externalized the cost by essentially using them as free labor. So,
I was going to say, at the rate that we incarcerate certain races, for example, black people, it is like a certain, what's the word for it? Like a genocide, like removing a group of people because, we always complain that there are fathers in some communities that are locking them up. Like huge majority.
yeah. So you have that there, and that's the like when we're talking about the logic of colonialism. The logic of colonialism is separating people into categories, right? And even like I said, when we get to race, we'll probably nod at this again, but the concept of race comes from colonialism. It doesn't exist prior to that, right? There's different ways that people acknowledge differences between each other. Religion, nationality, things like that. But it's not race, right? It's not built on biological differences, but race grows out of colonialism, right? Colonialism is a machine of creating distinctions between people. And you see that in the rhetoric of it, right? So like, other people are savages, and we are civilized. Remember us talking about that? The irony of talking about being civilized, right? That's a separation. It becomes a justification for the actions that we take. So, thinking about how we use the prison system, in Canada, this is the indigenous population, but who primarily goes to prison in the United States? What populations? You can do that.
Oh, I was the minority specifically, that's like black,
Yeah.
and like proportionally to like the population of the black people, like disproportionately,
Yeah. African Americans predominantly are the people who are incarcerated, then Latinos, then poor whites, right? So essentially you get poor people and minorities, right? Why, and so, okay, I'm going to ask another question. This actually will wind into restorative justice later today, or possibly Monday. What do most people go to prison for? I think we have to unthink what we normally think about prison. What sort of things are people actually incarcerated for? I mean, people do go to jail for murder. Yeah. Does anybody know what kind of drug charges? So marijuana, and what kind, you guys might not know the legal code enough to know the different kinds. Simple possession of marijuana. Most of our incarcerated population goes to jail for simple possession of marijuana. What does that mean? Well, practically, what does that mean for what they're actually going to jail for? What's simple possession mean? Do people know this?
Is it just when you have it in your home?
Yeah, you could be outside of your own home. It's for your own use. It's that you don't own enough marijuana to sell it. That's the sort of legal definition of simple possession. Otherwise, it's possession with intent to sell. And if it goes up, it's essentially like you can get smuggling charges or whatever, right? But most people are in prison for owning a small amount of marijuana for personal use. Now, I'm going to ask you a really hard, so we're thinking about African Americans going to prison and Latinos and poor people going to prison primarily for things like simple possession of marijuana. Do other populations use marijuana? Do suburban kids use marijuana? Yeah. Do wealthy kids living in high-rises downtown use marijuana? Do medical doctors use marijuana? Yes, but none of these people go to prison for it. And so there's something really odd there. And that's what the article to some degree is picking up on, is like, that's that colonial logic, right? We separate out populations via the prison system, but we still manage to justify it despite the fact that it's not actually deserved. Right? So how do we justify it? What's our image of criminals? So who do we generally think of as people who would go to prison, as opposed to the people who do? What would you assume most people are, like, most of the people in prison are? They're violent, right? We think of them as, if I say the word crime, what crime pops in your head usually? Murder. What pops in your head if I say the word crime? What do you picture people doing normally? What's that?
Violent robberies.
Violent robberies, bank robbers, right? All these sort of like, serial rapists, things like that, right? Actually, if you want a crime that you generally don't go to jail for, it's rape. Just generally speaking, if you want to get away with a crime, that's the crime that you can get away with. So our image is this sort of like violent criminal, and that gets applied to those populations that get sent there. But that's not what they're there for, right? And so here you see the same sort of logic, and it's actually very colonial, right? We're still thinking of people as savages, right? In the same way that we justify it on the basis of things that they weren't really doing, some sort of forms of genocidal action, right? Essentially, we're just doing a genocide where we don't have to kill people. But we separate them out from ourselves. What happens when you get out of prison? Usually. What happens to most people after they're done with prison? Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, like, super difficult to find a job. And when people hire, like, I don't know.
Yeah, people don't re-enter society after they get out of prison. They either become homeless, or they're stuck in menial jobs, or they're stuck living off of state aid, and they often are not, quite literally, afterwards, they are separated out into poorer communities, whether or not they started there, right? And so what we see is, actually this reinforcement of these boundaries via the prison system. So this is what they're kind of referring to when they say that it has the same logic that prisons are. So we're applying this in the United States, so like they did it with the indigenous population. What in the United States is the prison the continuation of? What institutions of our past are they similar? What sort of policies or institutions of the past in the United States does the prison system have similar outcomes to or logics to? Because most people in prison are not indigenous people in the United States. Right? They do have a higher incarceration rate, but not as high as some populations. Right? So what is it a continuation of? What do you think? So prisons are the things that keep African Americans and Latinos in this country poor and black. How is that? What sort of other previous things that we've done in the United States is that similar to?
Slavery and indentured.
Yeah, it's similar to what was done. So essentially, we actually can draw a line of things that in some ways work like slavery, but are not slavery. And they get quieter, and they get less forceful, but they're still there. Right? So you start with slavery. This isn't a justification. Slavery was a horrible system. It was a lot more violent than what we have now. So I'm not saying that, but it has a similar logic to it. Slavery is replaced by shareholders, where they're forced onto specific land, sharecropping, right? That's replaced by the ghettos of the early 20th century. And now that we no longer have segregation, you start getting prison. This is also really interesting because if you were to go into the past, 1960 and before, the prison population reflected the actual real population of the United States. which meant that white people were just as likely to be incarcerated as African Americans and Latinos in the 60s and in the 50s. Right? Why is there such a disparity? You know, it's because it's a continuation of that logic, right? And as I said, like that logic of separation, right, that segregation represented, you see this in other colonies much the same way. And I pointed to South Africa in the last class, right? It's very similar to the apartheid system. You know, segregation is often practiced in settler colonies. And here you see sort of like the continuation of segregation via, right, the prison system. Now, there's an important point to be backed up here, because like, now we're getting into things that you currently are hearing debates about. And I'm going to put it this way, whose fault is this system? It's a hard question.
I'm going to take a stab and say people, because...
Say you? I couldn't hear you.
I was just taking a stab and I want to say the people, because if the United States is supposed to be run by the people, then it's up to us to change policies, to change laws, and to change these sort of things. But we've gone kind of silent over the years and we stopped addressing it.
I kind of agree with like what he's saying, but I think there's like to an extent, like you can like, I don't think we're silent about everything, but like I feel like, I was just saying like we're not silent about everything, but I feel like there's only so much you can do, and then after that it's like, sometimes it's not enough. I don't know how to like explain that.
Anyone else? It's actually, I meant it as a trick question. It's not really anybody within our society specifically their fault. It's this continuation of a logic from the past that haunts us, right? Our institutions, and this is like, so like, and there's a difference between racism, and that's why we're, in sociology we talk about racism, or these articles that we've looked at, the article that we looked at talked about racism and race, racism and racists. Racism is institutional, right? So our institutions are structured in a way that has a continuing life. That's the point of the article, right? It's looking at it in a different context, but the point of the article is there's this continuation, right? Does that make sense? Cool. Any questions or thoughts people want to share? Reactions, positive or negative reactions to the article? When you hear my voice, you should think of me as a parrot of whatever we're reading. Not like I didn't write anything we read. So do not stray away from sharing opinions, one way or the other. I try to avoid giving my personal opinions from the front of the room as much as possible. So any questions or thoughts? Okay. Sorry. About a clock I gotta check on. We have 11 minutes. So let's get started on the restorative justice article, and then we'll roll into. Supposedly we're going to have a visitor on to come over with us on next Monday. Where the dean of the college is going to be in here, so it should be interesting. I'm going to try to get her to like chat and talk like we do. I'll see. Sometimes visitors will do that. Sometimes they won't. Okay, so. The other article, the second article, which I also think, even though it's about someplace else, is relevant to understanding our own system, is the political rationality of restorative justice. So for the next few minutes that we have, I want us to mostly just get down this idea of restorative justice, and then next week we'll talk about the critique of it. So one thing, just to get terms, what are juvenile offenders? Uses this term a lot, just make sure we all know this.
Is that somebody that's only like committed one crime?
No?
Aren't there young people who get caught committing some minor crimes?
Yeah. So, well, not only just minor crimes. Like a juvenile offender is somebody who gets caught committing a crime and is a minor, right? Is under the age of 18. So when it talks about juvenile offenders, it's specifically looking at policies surrounding juvenile offenders. Okay. The other is kind of like, what are how big of a question I want to ask. Okay, so how do we view, what are prisons for? Let's start here, because restorative justice is an alternative that gets used.
Well, I feel it's a place to keep dangerous people safe from law-abiding persons.
It's a way of separating out dangers. Well, but thinking about like what we just talked about, most of the people in prison aren't dangerous.
Well, there are some, like, okay, at the beginning of COVID starting, my mom got upset because, I don't remember where it was, but on the news they said that they were releasing prisoners and there were some who have committed very bad crimes, so.
Yeah, I mean there are, yeah, but like if we're talking about use, right, if that's its function, then it's probably not really doing it, right? See what I mean? Like, if only 1 out of every 20 people is violent in prison, then are we separating out dangerous people?
Probably not.
You know? So like what, I guess in other ways, what is the point of the criminal justice system?
I guess to kind of answer your prison question, I would say it's a place to, I want to say punish, but I don't like the word, but a place to punish somebody so that way they can think about the action that they did and I guess reevaluate their actions and lifestyle.
Yeah, so that's a very good like reform definition of what a prison's for. But like, yeah, totally. So like punishment, right? And there's the one reason we punish people is reform, right? There's another reason why sometimes we punish people. We talked about this at the beginning of the week, which is that idea of deterrence, right? So these are kind of like the goals of our criminal justice system as we understand them in the United States. So what might be some problems with the prison as an institution to do these things? We already kind of nodded at some problems, which is like when people come out, they're poor, which actually increases, like recidivism rates are extremely high, right? What else might be an issue with a prison as a way of carrying this out?
Yeah, like prisons are privately owned, people can like profit off of people in prison.
So yeah, there's definitely, like when we get to the critiques, public and private merger stuff is true in both the system that this is about restorative, which we'll wind our way up to. So kind of like the idea behind restorative justice is if you're, rather than these goals, if you're interested in allowing victims, right, to essentially recover from being victimized is a goal, or if your goal is to essentially make it so that after being punished, criminals can re-enter society, then our prison system doesn't really work, right? So they replaced it in England with something called restorative justice. Which is meant to replace prison systems for particularly minor crimes. So things like if a teenager in the United States commits an act of vandalism, it's very likely that he'll end up going to a juvenile center, which is basically just a prison for kids, right? That's, in England, there's a very different outcome that happens. So, did anybody catch what restorative justice is from that? It's an article on restorative justice. Because the relationship between the community, the offender, and the victim are very different.
Well, let's
justice is right, but with restorative justice, where like, it was more like a community, they would like, if they committed a crime, they would punish them as like intense as the crime they committed, but they would like, it was like community based to help them like amends for it.
Yeah, and that's exactly kind of what it is. So in our system, the state punishes you on the set of predetermined punishments, and then you go back into the system after. For restorative justice, you commit the crime, right? So you commit your crime. In this case, I like to do vandalism, right? The example, that's a baseball bat. I don't know, this is somebody's mailbox. Right? And rather than in our system going to jail and possibly juvenile home, they instead take him, the police would take him to a community meeting which are these like open forum meetings in which the victim would have a chance to address the person who did it, make suggestions of what they would like to see happen, and the person who perpetrated can react to that, and either the community itself, depending on the severity of the crime, or a judge will moderate what they, essentially that interaction, and decide whether the punishment should actually occur. So why make this work better for reintegrating people into the community? What do you think? Why might this build more community, or allow the person who commits a crime to re-enter it while still being punished? Go ahead.
I think they learn to trust each other more.
Yeah, everyone learns to trust each other more. So rather than alienating the person gets equally punished, right? But they're essentially being drawn back into the community. That's the idea of restorative justice. So it's like, rather than, and often like the punishment involves something that involves the community itself, right? So like, in this case, you know, the kid smashed the mailbox, the community decides, well, he's got to replace the mailbox. You know, he's got to pay for it. If he can't pay for it, then he's got to work for the guy whose mailbox he smashed. And then he's also going to compensate him by compensate for his, like, you know, emotional distress or whatever by doing these other set activities. So actually, like, what happens is that the offender ends up doing things that are beneficial to the community itself as well as the victim, right? As punishment. Does it make sense? So we're gonna end there, and so keep this in your head. And then when we start back on Monday, we're gonna start talking about some of the dangers and pitfalls of this system as it's actually practiced in England. So, and we're gonna see it actually ends up creating, even though this sounds really fantastic, some of the same problems as our own system.
Is the discussion still due on Sunday?
Yeah, because I'm still going to want you to have everything read, so.